Welcome back to the Liberty and Democracy podcast. We are currently working on building several new websites and podcasts connected with the topic of freedom and democracy and plan on offering weekly episodes to freedom and democracy-loving people from all over the world. We're happy to continue sharing our episodes with you. In today's episode, we focus on the courageous people of Cuba. Today's episode is thus titled, Freedom is Not Given, It is Reclaimed, a Message of Truth, Hope, and Courage for the Cuban People. Okay, are you ready to begin? Let's do it! Freedom is not given, it is reclaimed. A message of truth, hope, and courage for the Cuban people. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Declaration of Independence, 1776. To every Cuban reading these words, you were not born to be controlled. You were not born to stand in lines for ration food, to whisper your opinions in the privacy of your own home, to watch your children grow up in fear of speaking freely. You were born with dignity, a dignity that no government, no ideology, no dictator can ever legitimately take from you. This article is written for you, the Cuban mother who wants a better future for her children, the young man who dreams of starting a business, the elderly woman who remembers when Cuba was different, and the student who secretly wonders, why does the rest of the world live differently than we do? The answer begins with understanding something that the Cuban government does not want you to know. Freedom is not a privilege granted by the state. It is a God-given right woven into your very humanity. The divine foundation of human freedom. Throughout human history, across every culture, every religion, every civilization, there has been a consistent recognition that human beings possess a dignity that comes from something greater than government. This is not a Western idea. It is not an American idea. It is a universal truth. The Bible declares in Genesis 1 verse 27 that human beings are made in the image of God. This single truth is revolutionary. If you bear the image of your Creator, then no earthly ruler can claim total ownership of your life, your thoughts, your labor, or your conscience. Governments are instituted to serve the people, not the other way around. The great Cuban poet and independence hero José Martí understood this deeply. He wrote, "Mankind is composed of two sorts of men, those who love and create, and those who hate and destroy." Martí gave his life fighting for Cuba's freedom, not to replace one master with another, but so that Cubans could live as free human beings under God and self-governance. The natural rights that belong to every person, regardless of nationality, race, or political belief, include the right to speak freely, to express your thoughts without fear of imprisonment, the right to worship, to practice your faith without government interference, the right to own property, to enjoy the fruits of your own labor, the right to choose your leaders, to have a genuine voice in how you are governed, the right to a fair trial. To be presumed innocent until proven guilty. The right to move freely. To travel, to emigrate, to return. These are not gifts from the state. They are yours by birth. Any government that systematically denies these rights to its people has lost its moral legitimacy to govern. 2. How the Cuban regime maintains its grip. Understanding the machinery of oppression is the first step toward dismantling it. The Cuban government, in power since Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution, has employed a sophisticated and multi-layered system of control that keeps 11 million people locked in submission. Here is how it works. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, CDRs. Established in 1960, the CDRs are neighborhood spy networks covering virtually every city block in Cuba. Neighbors are encouraged, and sometimes pressured, to report on neighbors. A casual conversation criticizing the government can result in a visit from state security. This system breeds distrust, silence, and self-censorship. When people cannot trust their own neighbors, community solidarity becomes impossible, and solidarity is what regimes fear most. Monopoly on information and media. In Cuba, all major media, television, radio, newspapers, is state-owned and state-controlled. The Internet is heavily restricted and monitored. Independent journalists are arrested, harassed, and imprisoned. During the historic July 11, 2021 protests, known as 11J, the government shut down Internet access to prevent Cubans from communicating with each other and with the outside world. When a government fears the free flow of information, it is because the truth is its greatest enemy. Economic dependency and scarcity as control. The Cuban state is the dominant employer. To lose favor with the government is to risk losing your job, your home, your access to food rations, and your children's educational opportunities. This economic stranglehold ensures that even those who privately oppose the regime often comply publicly out of sheer survival. Poverty is not an accident of bad policy, it is a feature of the control system. The actos de repudio, mobs against dissidents. When a Cuban citizen speaks out, the state sometimes organizes coordinated mob attacks called actos de repudio, acts of repudiation, in which government loyalists surround and attack the home or person of a dissident. These state-sanctioned mobs send a clear message to anyone considering speaking out: you will be alone, and we will use your community against you. Arbitrary detention and the pre-criminal danger law. Cuba's legal system contains a shocking provision: a person can be imprisoned not for committing a crime, but for being deemed likely to commit one in the future. This pre-criminal social danger law allows authorities to imprison activists, religious leaders, and dissenters without ever having to prove wrongdoing. Many of Cuba's political prisoners, including those jailed after the 11J protests, have been held for years under such pretexts. Propaganda from birth. From the first days of school, Cuban children are taught that the revolution is sacred, that Fidel Castro was a near-divine figure, that the United States is the source of all Cuba's problems, and that questioning the system is a form of betrayal. Generations have been raised on a carefully curated version of reality designed to make the unacceptable seem normal. Restricting movement. For decades, Cubans needed government permission to travel within their own country and were banned from leaving without state approval. While some restrictions have eased, the threat of losing residency rights and all property keeps many from permanently emigrating. The regime has weaponized the desire to stay near family as a chain. 3. Cuba before the revolution, a forgotten story. One of the most powerful tools of the current regime is historical amnesia. The Cuban government has worked for over 60 years to make sure that Cubans, especially young Cubans, cannot imagine their country being anything other than what it is today. But Cuba had a different story. Before 1959, Cuba was one of the most economically developed nations in Latin America. By many measures in the 1950s, Havana was a vibrant, cosmopolitan city. Cuba had one of the highest literacy rates in Latin America and a growing middle class. A free press with dozens of independent newspapers and radio stations. A functioning, if imperfect, democratic system with elections and constitutional government. A dynamic economy that attracted investment and produced a prosperous merchant and professional class. A rich cultural life, world-renowned music, art, architecture, and literature that made Havana one of the cultural capitals of the Western Hemisphere. Private enterprise, Cubans owned businesses, farms, restaurants, and newspapers. Was pre-revolutionary Cuba perfect? No. There was inequality. There was corruption under Batista. There were injustices that needed addressing. But the answer to imperfect democracy is better democracy, not the abolition of freedom altogether. What the revolution delivered was not justice. It was the replacement of one set of problems with total control. The educated middle class fled. The press was shuttered. Churches were harassed. Private property was seized. And decade after decade, the promises of the revolution, equality, prosperity, dignity, remained perpetually unfulfilled, always blamed on someone else. The Cuba that existed before is proof that the Cuba that can exist in the future is not a fantasy. It is a memory waiting to become real again. 4. The failures of authoritarian socialism. History is an honest judge. We can look around the world and ask, where has authoritarian, one-party socialist control produced lasting human flourishing? The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 after 70 years of promising utopia and delivering misery. North Korea remains the most isolated and impoverished nation in Asia, its people kept in darkness while the Kim dynasty lives in luxury. Venezuela, which adopted Cuban-style socialism in the early 2000s, went from the wealthiest nation in South America to a humanitarian catastrophe within 2 decades. Contrast these with nations that chose freedom, even flawed, messy, imperfect freedom. South Korea, once as poor as North Korea, is today a global economic powerhouse. Eastern European nations that broke free from Soviet control in 1989 have rebuilt democratic societies with rising standards of living. Chile, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Latin American nations that have strengthened democratic institutions have achieved levels of prosperity and freedom that Cuba's government insists are impossible. The pattern is unmistakable. Freedom works. Oppression fails. The only question is whether those in power will admit it, and history shows they rarely do until the people themselves demand change. What a free Cuba will look like. Hope is not naive. Hope is the confident expectation of a better future based on the evidence of what free people can accomplish. Here is what awaits Cuba on the other side of its liberation. A flourishing economy. When Cubans are free to own businesses, to invest, to innovate, to trade openly with the world, the results will be transformational. Cuba has everything it needs to prosper: a beautiful country, a strategic location, a warm climate ideal for agriculture and tourism, and most importantly, a people renowned for their creativity, resilience, and intelligence. The Cuban diaspora, millions of Cubans and Cuban Americans in Miami, Madrid, and around the world, have built businesses, hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions. That same energy, that same entrepreneurial spirit, exists in every Cuban on the island. It simply needs to be unleashed. Families reunited. One of the cruelest dimensions of the current system is how it has scattered Cuban families across the globe. A free Cuba will be a Cuba where families are whole, where no one has to choose between their homeland and their freedom, where children do not grow up separated from parents who fled, where the elderly do not die before seeing their sons and daughters again. A voice for every Cuban. In a democratic Cuba, every adult citizen will have an equal vote. Politicians will compete for your support, not your fear. Your opinion will matter. Your community's needs will shape policy. The era of the strongman who rules for life, who passes power to his brother, who governs not by consent but by force, that era will end. Freedom to worship. Cuba's religious communities, Catholic, Protestant, Santeria, Jewish, and others, have survived decades of state hostility. In a free Cuba, faith will flourish openly. Churches will not need to negotiate their existence with party officials. Pastors will not be monitored. Believers will not risk their careers to attend worship services. A cultural renaissance. Cuba has produced extraordinary artists, musicians, writers, and athletes despite the regime, not because of it. Imagine what Cuban creativity will produce when it is fully free. The world already loves Cuban music and Cuban art. A liberated Cuban culture, no longer forced to serve state propaganda, will astonish the world. The return of the exiles. When Cuba is free, those who fled will have the choice to return. They will bring with them capital, skills, connections, and most importantly, the experience of living in free societies. The reunion of Cuba's internal and external communities will be one of the most powerful social forces the Caribbean has ever seen. 6. The courage of those who came before. You are not alone in this struggle, and you are not the first to face it. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in a South African prison. He was told that apartheid was permanent, that black South Africans would never govern themselves. He was wrong to believe it. The regime was wrong to think it could last. In 1994, Mandela walked out of prison and into the presidency of a free South Africa. Lech Walesa was an electrician in Poland who helped organize Solidarity, the first free trade union behind the Iron Curtain. The communist government imprisoned him, declared martial law, and crushed the movement. A decade later, Walesa was elected president of a free Poland. The Cuban people themselves have shown extraordinary courage. The ladies in white, Damas de Blanco, wives and mothers of political prisoners, have marched silently through Havana in white dresses every Sunday for years, facing harassment and arrest, refusing to be silenced. On July 11, 2021, Cubans in more than 50 cities took to the streets in the largest spontaneous protests since the revolution, chanting Libertad. Patria y vida. Knowing the risks and choosing courage anyway. These acts of courage are not small. Every person who refuses to participate in a forced rally, every person who shares the truth with a neighbor, every person who refuses to inform on a friend, each of these is an act of resistance. History does not forget them. 7. A message of hope. Better days are coming. To the Cuban people, hear this clearly. The night is darkest before dawn. And the dawn is coming. No authoritarian regime in history has lasted forever. Not the Roman Empire. Not the Soviet Union. Not apartheid South Africa. Not the Iron Curtain. Every system built on the suppression of human freedom carries within it the seeds of its own collapse, because it is working against nature itself. You cannot permanently imprison the human spirit. Cuba's current government is aging. Its ideology has been discredited by history. Its economy, despite 6 decades of promises, cannot feed, clothe, or employ its own people. Its young people watch the wider world through cracked open windows of internet access and understand, in their hearts, that another way of life is possible. The question is not whether Cuba will be free. The question is when, and how many people will have the courage to shorten the wait. Here is what you can do today. Preserve the truth. Speak it quietly, carefully, to people you trust. The regime survives on lies. Every truth spoken is a brick removed from its foundation. Hold on to your dignity. You are not what the state says you are. You are a human being made in the image of God, with inherent worth that no government can grant or revoke. Remember your history. Cuba was great before. Cuba will be great again. Know that the world sees you. Cubans in the diaspora, human rights organizations, religious communities, and millions of people around the world are watching, advocating, and praying for your freedom. Pass this hope to your children. The generation that will see Cuba free may be the children being born today. Raise them knowing their worth. Raise them knowing their rights. Raise them knowing that the world their parents endured was not normal, and it will not be permanent. Closing, Patria y Vida. In 2021, a group of Cuban musicians recorded a song that spread like wildfire through Cuba and the world, Patria y Vida, Homeland and Life. It was a direct rebuke of the regime's old slogan, Patria o Muerte, Homeland or Death. The regime chose death as its symbol. The people chose life. That instinct, that stubborn, beautiful, irrepressible preference for life, for freedom, for dignity, cannot be legislated away. It cannot be rationed. It cannot be imprisoned. It is in you. José Martí wrote, "A genuine man goes to the roots. To be a radical is no more than that, to go to the roots." The root of Cuba's situation is simple, a government afraid of its own people. And governments afraid of their own people do not survive history. Cuba will be free. Hold on. Take courage. The better days are not just possible, they are inevitable. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Galatians 5 verse 1. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This article was written in the spirit of truth and human dignity, in solidarity with all people living under oppression, and in the enduring belief that freedom is not just a political preference, it is the birthright of every human soul. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Liberty and Democracy podcast. In today's episode, we sent a message to the courageous people of Cuba. We hope you subscribed to our podcast and enjoyed listening to Freedom is Not Given, It is Reclaimed, a message of truth, hope, and courage for the Cuban people. Did you know that Joan Alves Cerci, also known as Maestro Cerci, a survivor of Eastern Bloc socialism and the creator of this podcast, is also an accomplished music producer who has published numerous political music albums and songs dedicated to victims of Marxism, socialism, communism, and dictatorships all over the world? Yes, he has recently published Freedom in Havana, a music album dedicated to the resilient people of Cuba. Freedom in Havana is available on Apple Music, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and numerous other streaming platforms available all over the world. Check out the links in the description section below to access today's episode as well as to listen and share the powerful songs included in our album Freedom in Havana. Thank you all, and don't forget to listen to our other transformative podcast episodes celebrating democracy and freedom.